To all of you in both rooms with this overflow crowd, which we're delighted to see, it's my great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague of many years, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton serves as Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and has had, as you know, a long and distinguished career in public service. He's served in high-level positions in several administrations, including in the positions of Permanent U.S. Representative to the United Nations, Undersecretary of State for, excuse me, I'm going back and forth between disarmament and arms control, pardon me, arms control and international security, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, Assistant Attorney General, and General Counsel of the United States Agency for International Development. He's performed, in my view, a special service for the country in his intellectual honesty and candor, and for that I thank you. As the late Bill Safire might have said, Ambassador Bolton is congenitally frank. I know that you're as eager as I am to hear his talk tonight on President Obama's new international order, and so thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Madeline, for your kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming this evening. I want to cover what I think is the Obama's view of the international order, and then try and take questions. So there's no doubt that there are a lot of subjects I won't cover in my opening remarks, but I'm more than happy to try and address them during the Q&A session that will follow. I think we obviously have a very, very different kind of president in office. I've described him as the first post-American president. He's not the first candidate of a major party to hold the views that he does, but he's certainly the first one to have been elected. And I think that you can summarize a very complex subject by looking at the answer to a question he gave on his last European trip, where a reporter asked whether President Obama believed in American exceptionalism. And it was a long prefatory statement before he asked the question, but American exceptionalism, in short substance, is the idea that America is a different kind of country than others, founded on an idea, what the Pilgrims called the shining city, or the city on the hill, what Ronald Reagan amended to the shining city on the hill, what some called the New Jerusalem. And President Obama's answer was really quite interesting, because he started off by saying, I believe in American exceptionalism. And then he went on in the same sentence to say, just as the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. So, in the first third of the sentence, he's able to say, I believe in American exceptionalism, thus providing a black and white answer to people like me who say that he doesn't. But in the last two-thirds of the sentence, he takes it all back. Because obviously, if Brits and Greeks can believe in their exceptionalism, just like Americans, so can the 189 other members of the United Nations believe in Ecuadorian exceptionalism and Zimbabwean exceptionalism and Nepalese exceptionalism. Now, obviously, if everybody is exceptional, nobody is exceptional. So in a very adroit way, and he is a wordsmith, the President, I think, made it clear that he doesn't think Americans are any more exceptional than anybody else. Now, as I say, this is not the first time we've seen somebody with these kinds of views. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, referring to Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, said, my opponent sees the United States as just another pleasant country out there on the UN roll call somewhere between Albania and Zimbabwe. And I think that was an accurate description of the Dukakis views, and I think it's an accurate description of Obama's views. And I think we have seen that already translated into a number of specifics that I want to address in turn. I think there's one other aspect of the President's approach that's significant, and that is that in terms of his priorities as President, he just doesn't see foreign policy as that important. He said during the campaign, for example, he considers Iran to be a tiny country, and along with others, he doesn't see terrorism as the kind of threat that his predecessor did. And his views of the risks of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are also very different. So it's not illogical if you don't think the rest of the world is very challenging to the United States. You can turn your attention to domestic issues like restructuring our health care system, restructuring our automobile manufacturing system, restructuring our energy and environmental policies, restructuring our banking and financial systems, and if I've left anything out, I'm sure he's going to get to it in due course. I think this is fundamentally mistaken. Because however much we are engrossed in the important task of righting the economy and moving back onto the path of recovery, or however much we care about the intricacies of the debate over health care, our adversaries and challengers around the world are not that interested, and they are looking at whether we're paying attention and how we're paying attention. So while we're consumed with these debates, they are drawing their own conclusions. Whatever way we come out on health care, although if I had to bet, my bet would be that Kim Jong-il favors the public option. So let's take a couple of specific examples of the Obama policy as it has played out. Because I think that's more useful, and anyway, I'm a Burkean conservative, and abstract discussions I think often don't get us very far. And I'd like to start with Iran because it's obviously in the news, and because I think it is indicative of how the President sees his policies being implemented and dealing with some of the issues that are unavoidably on his desk. Now, Iran has been pursuing a clandestine nuclear weapons program for close to 20 years. It has repeatedly, over the years, lied to the International Atomic Energy Agency, concealed information from the IAEA, given up information only grudgingly when it's disclosed publicly by Iranian opposition groups, obstructed the work of IAEA inspectors, and generally performed in a way that makes it clear that the explanation for this behavior is that it's got something to hide. We just saw yet another demonstration of this last week with the revelation of this uranium enrichment site being constructed at the holy city of Qum, southwest of Tehran. But it's neither the first time nor, let me suggest to you, will it be the last time that that happens. What we can talk about publicly, what's been described in IAEA reports long ago, I think should have disabused anybody from the notion that Iran's nuclear program is purely for peaceful civil nuclear purposes. I once asked why a country with as much oil and natural gas as Iran was pursuing peaceful civil nuclear programs to begin with. And the explanation from Iran is, look, we're running out of our oil and natural gas. We have to think ahead. So I asked, when I was still in the government, I asked the U.S. Department of Energy to take a look at their estimates of Iran's reserves of gas and of oil and natural gas and make some estimate when they would run out. And the Department of Energy, this is now 5 or 6 years ago, looking at Iran's current consumption, exports, what they estimated the reserves to be, came back and said, well, you know, the Iranians are right. They are running out of oil and natural gas. And at their present rates of export and consumption, they'll run out of oil and natural gas in about 300 or 400 years. So I mean, any prudent, this is not a Rudy Giuliani moment, any prudent policy planner is going to prepare against that contingency. But there's plenty of other information that's out there. In publicly available IAEA reports, for example, 5 years ago, the IAEA reported that they had obtained from Iran, because of specific requests they had made, information about how you fabricate uranium or plutonium metal into hollow hemispheres. Now, this is a technique that is critical to building nuclear weapons. The way you do it is you take two hollow hemispheres of enriched uranium or plutonium, like the hollow hemispheres on the globes that we all had as kids. You put the two hollow hemispheres together, you surround it with high explosives, you detonate the high explosives simultaneously, it crushes the metal into a much smaller ball. That creates the critical mass that gives you the uncontrolled chain reaction of a nuclear explosion. There is no peaceful use for hollow hemispheres of uranium or plutonium metal. We know also that, that Iran developed weaponization information. This was information, much of which has since been discussed in the public domain, but which Secretary of State Powell announced in December of 2004 that we had. I was very glad he did it rather than me. But which forms much of the basis, I think, of the concern that intelligence services other than our own has about what Iran is up to. And I could go on and on and on. This is a weapons program. There's not the slightest doubt about it. Now, up until the inauguration of President Obama, the Bush administration, contrary to a lot of political rhetoric, was pursuing a multilateral policy. It was following the European countries, Britain, France, and Germany, and laterally in the process the involvement of the European Commission itself, in an effort to negotiate with Iran to convince them to give up their nuclear program. And in exchange for that, the Iranians could have a completely different relationship with Europe and the United States. And it was known throughout these negotiations, known from the outset, that the Europeans were speaking for the United States. And for this entire period of now going on 7 years, the negotiations went back and forth and back and forth, and the Europeans constantly talking in terms of carrots and sticks, the language of incentives and disincentives. And the way these meetings would go over the years is the Europeans would trundle off to Tehran or Geneva or wherever, and they'd put a basket of carrots out on the table, and the Iranians would say, well, that's very interesting, that's a good place to start, but we want this other carrot, we want this other carrot, and basically we're not going to talk about suspending our uranium enrichment program. And this would puzzle the Europeans, but they'd go back to their capitals and mull it over for a while, and then they'd have another meeting and put more carrots on the table. And the Iranians would reject that, and so it went. The Europeans were very creative. They had a virtually inexhaustible list of carrots to present to the Iranians, and they did, time and time again. And the Iranians kept saying, that's fine, but we're not going to give you the quid pro quo of suspending our uranium enrichment program, except for one time when we now know pretty convincingly that they had run into technical difficulties and basically had to stop work in some respects anyway. So the history up until now has been years of efforts, multilateral efforts, using carrots and sticks, sticks being Security Council sanctions, to dissuade Iran from continuing its nuclear weapons program. And in fact, when the Iranians have resisted efforts by the IAEA, when they have engaged in activity that was eventually contrary to a Security Council resolution, the Council imposed at successive points 3 sanctions resolutions on Iran. Resolutions that were watered down by the Russians and the Chinese, although watered down by the Europeans too. One suggestion that the U.S. is now floating again would be a cutoff of export credits for exports to Iran. And I remember in late 2006, we were negotiating exactly that suggestion. And up in New York, I gave a draft of our view on that to the Germans and the French and the British. And the reaction of the Germans was, well, this prohibition on export credits is really, it's really pretty strong. You know, that would inhibit exports to Iran. Well, no kidding. And so it was never included. This is, you know, first you negotiate with the Europeans, then you negotiate with the Russians and the Chinese. But I'm not really here to rehearse all this history, except to say that the idea that President Obama is providing carrots and sticks for the Iranians to choose from, that he's prepared to engage in negotiations, and that if the Iranians are not forthcoming, he's prepared to go for stricter sanctions, I think to Tehran must seem a lot like the movie Groundhog Day. Except that this time the Americans are actually going to be sitting there and speaking. But the substance of what's being presented is fundamentally unchanged. So here we are with years having gone by as Iran has continued its progress on both the nuclear weapons and the ballistic missile front. And let's be clear, Iran's interest in ballistic missiles is not because of an abstract interest in physical principles. It's to create a delivery system basically for nuclear weapons, because it's extraordinarily inefficient to use an ICBM or a ballistic missile of shorter range simply to deliver conventional warheads, at least for Iran in its current military posture. So right now we are, I think, facing a situation with very little time remaining. And yet we have the President talking about making sure that Iran follows its international obligations, and chairing a meeting of the Security Council where the Council unanimously passes a resolution that doesn't mention Iran or North Korea, but calls for work to avoid the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. This is a focus on the abstract rather than the concrete, and it's actually gotten to the point where at the press conference in Pittsburgh, where President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Brown and President Obama stood together, that the leaders of Britain and France, after 6+ years of negotiation, failed negotiation with Iran, took a harder line than the President of the United States. And in fact, very interesting to read would be President Sarkozy's speech to the Security Council. It's posted in English on the French UN mission's website, where, knowing obviously of this uranium enrichment facility at Qum, he laid out, I think, a position that I personally would have been very comfortable with. So we now have the anomaly that our European allies are out in front of the United States. What is the situation now with Iran that we really face? I think there are 4 options. One is that Iran gets nuclear weapons. Now, frankly, I think that's what's going to happen. I think the time for diplomacy and sanctions have passed. I think we wasted too much time in fruitless negotiations. And I think Iran's progress is such that there's no external political or economic force that can stop them. Now, some in the administration and in our public debate say, well, look, that's not a problem. We can contain and deter a nuclear Iran just as we did the Soviet Union. And all I can say is, well, good luck with that. I don't know anybody who would want to go back into a world where we lived under the threat of mutual assured destruction. The one thing you could say about the Soviets was that since most of them at least professed to be communist and atheist, they knew they only went around once. They weren't so worried about life in the hereafter. In Tehran, that seems to be the favored place to be. I think the American view is summed up by the country and western song that goes, I won't sing it, but the country and western song that goes something like, everybody want to go to heaven, but nobody want to go now. So the notion that the calculus of deterrence on both sides is going to work as it did in the Cold War, which came close to breaking down on any number of occasions, I don't think is likely to work here. And beside that, it's not simply a question of a nuclear Iran. If Iran goes nuclear, you can count on other countries in the region doing the same, likely Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and perhaps others. So you then end up with a Middle East with half a dozen states with nuclear weapons, and the odds of the three-dimensional chess of deterrence and containment in the Middle East breaking down. So I would say Iran getting nuclear weapons is the least optimal outcome, but at this point probably the most likely. The second option is more diplomacy and talk about more sanctions. That's the policy the President's currently pursuing. With Iran's reaction in Geneva today, I think we're up for another couple of laps at least around the diplomacy track while the Iranians continue to spin their centrifuges. There are talks of other kinds of side deals out there. I'll believe it when I see it. There's talk about stricter sanctions. They're not going to work. The issue here is not, can you adopt sanctions that cause Iran some economic pain? I don't doubt we can do that. The issue is, can you come up with sanctions sufficient to dissuade Iran from continuing its nuclear program? And I think we are past the point where that can happen. The third option is regime change in Iran, and by that I don't mean getting rid of Ahmadinejad, I mean getting rid of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. It is deeply unpopular in Iran. They've had 3 decades of economic mismanagement. The young people, who comprise 2/3 of the population under 30, are educated, sophisticated. They know they could have a different life without the Islamic Revolution in control, and they can see it in the countries right across the Persian Gulf, and they know there's an alternative. And then finally, there's deep ethnic dissatisfaction inside Iran. Only 50% of the population is Persian. Ethnic Arabs, Turkmen, Azeris, Kurds, Balukis, and others unhappy about the situation that they face. Not all of these fissures overlap entirely. There are some cross currents there, but dissatisfaction is deep. And I think we saw some evidence of how deep it was when the people came into the streets after the fraudulent June 12 election. That aftermath represented a clear missed opportunity for the United States. Had the Bush administration been doing much of anything during the prior 8 years to support the dissidents and the opposition, we might have had a moment there to really overturn that regime. I think that opportunity's gone. I think within Iran, power is now flowing actually away from the mullahs and toward the Revolutionary Guards, moving more in the direction of a military dictatorship. I still think we should support the opposition, but to be realistic, you can't turn regime change on and off like a light switch. So at best, it would be sometime down the road, and I fear, unfortunately, after Iran would already have nuclear weapons, which leaves the option of preemptive military force against Iran's program, the fourth possibility. Now, nobody believes that even a successful use of force would stop the Iranian program, but it could well set it back 2, 3, or more years. And in the life of a nuclear proliferator, that's an infinity. It buys us time for a change. It puts time back on our side rather than the side of the proliferator. I view it as a near 100% certainty that the Obama administration will not use force. Therefore, the decision whether or not it's going to happen rests with Israel. And I don't know what their calculus is, but I think if anything, the disclosure of the facility at Qum raises the difficulty for Israel to an even higher level, because as we have worried over the years, if the Iranians have built redundant facilities at Qum, likely they have tried to build them elsewhere. They've been trying to disperse and further harden their nuclear program. They're seeking advanced air defense systems from the Russians. The military option is a declining option over time. There's no particular red line for Israel, but I don't think they've got more than 6 months if they're going to make that decision. And then after that, you come back to the default answer here, which is that Iran gets nuclear weapons. So we're 8 months into the Obama administration, and what's the net-net at this point? It is that Iran is 8 months closer to achieving a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. And I will predict to you that if we're here next year, we'll be in basically the same position. We'll still be trying to talk to them once the State Department sits down at that negotiating table. It's very hard to get up. People will say, oh, don't do anything to disrupt the process. The Russians will be saying they don't want sanctions. The Chinese will be investing more capital in Iran's oil and natural gas fields. And I think Iran will just be proceeding merrily down the path toward becoming a nuclear state, and that other countries in the Middle East will be drawing their own conclusions. So I don't blame this likely end result entirely on Obama, of course. He hasn't been in office long enough. The bulk of the responsibility here, I think, rests with the failed policies of the Bush administration. My trouble with Obama is that he's taking those very failed policies and extending them, even in the face of harder evidence that the Iranians are not going to be chit-chatted out of their nuclear weapons program. Much of what's wrong with the Obama view of the world is reflected as well in how he has tried to deal with North Korea, the other side of this continuing axis of evil in the proliferation business. You'll recall that in his inaugural address, the President said he wanted to reach out that open hand if only the rogue state leaders would unclench their fist. Well, we've seen what Iran has done. What has that happy-go-lucky fella Kim Jong-il done in North Korea? Well, he's detonated his second nuclear weapon. He's tested ballistic missiles. He has seized and held hostage American reporters and used them as bait in his negotiating efforts with the United States. And he's generally shown not the slightest willingness to make the hard decisions to give up the North Korean nuclear weapons program. And in many respects, North Korea has the same view as Iran. They're not going to be negotiated out of that program. They see it as a trump card in their dealings with the U.S., Japan, and really with their own population. So I'm a little surprised that the administration hasn't found a way to get the six-party talks, which was a Bush administration initiative, back on track so that we can sit down and begin making economic and political concessions to North Korea, which is the normal order of things, at least in North Korea's mind. I wouldn't be surprised now that we've had this breakthrough with Iran that we'll get another session of the six-party talks before the end of the year. But here's the point, both for North Korea and for Iran. The negotiations are such that they favor their interests. Negotiations are just like any other human activity. They have costs and they have benefits. And the question of when it's in your interest to negotiate and how, you have to look at in the context of the specific dispute. And in the case of North Korea, negotiations work in their favor as well, because it brings everybody together to talk to them about what to do about a program that they don't intend to give up. And inevitably, as with the agreed framework of 1994, as with the agreements that the Bush administration reached in early 2007 and many other commitments, that all translates into North Korea extracting resources from its negotiating partners. North Korea loves to negotiate about giving up its nuclear weapons program. North Korea loves to commit to giving up its nuclear weapons program. In the last 20 years, it's committed to do it at least 4 separate times. It just never seems to get around to actually doing anything about it. And I think we can see that North Korea's program is far from static. Courtesy of the Israeli Air Force in September of 2007, we know that North Korea was constructing a nuclear reactor where? Near Pyongyang? Near the Russian border? No, it was constructing it in Syria, where it's had a long and close cultural and historical relationship. Joke, okay? The full story, of course, is not known. Syria has obstructed the IAEA, lied to the IAEA. I could go down this road too, but there's still much we don't know. My guess is that reactor on the banks of the Euphrates was a 3-way joint venture between Syria, Iran, and North Korea. I don't think Syria had the wherewithal to have a nuclear reactor constructed on its own dime. I think Iran and North Korea both had congruent interest. If you want to hide your nuclear weapons program from prying eyes, what better place to hide it than in Syria, where nobody's looking? And it was a very logical thing for the two of them to have done, and I think reflecting also the kind of cooperation that has likely gone on between Iran and North Korea over the years. This is not a metaphor of an axis of evil. This is real cooperation, both using the same Soviet-era Scud missile technology for their missile programs, both benefiting from the AQCON proliferation network, both, I think, sharing information about uranium enrichment and other critical steps in the course toward nuclear weapons. North Korea, therefore, is not going to give up its nuclear weapons through negotiation either, despite what the President said. And even though it's been quiet on the North Korean front, you cannot assume that that means that there's nothing to worry about. North Korea is basically a criminal state. It will sell anything to anybody for hard currency. It counterfeits American money very successfully. It sells illegal narcotics through its diplomatic pouches. It sells all manner of conventional weapons, and I think if the hard currency were made available to it, it would sell nuclear weapons or radioactive material to al-Qaeda or other terrorists simply to get the extra cash. North Korea is not just a threat in Northeast Asia. North Korea is a threat globally, and the President's efforts, again, 8 months in, show no progress in affecting North Korea's behavior. Now, there's another problem in the nuclear proliferation area that I think it's fair to say the Bush administration did not pay adequate attention to, and I, up until about a month ago, would have given the Obama administration great credit for understanding the importance of not allowing Pakistan to fall to radical elements like Taliban or al-Qaeda, because from publicly available sources we know that Pakistan has between 60 and 200 nuclear weapons. That capacity in the hands of a radical regime would heighten the risk of war on the Indian subcontinent, where conventional struggle might easily escalate to a nuclear level, or even worse, I think, for the world as a whole, that with radicals in control of that arsenal, they could sell or give some to terrorists and thus pose a global threat of a terrorist action with a nuclear weapon. This threat posed by Pakistan obviously is linked to Taliban activities in Afghanistan. And as I say, I think it was a sound move by the Obama administration to recognize that how to deal with the Taliban and the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan was linked because of the cross-border nature of the activity to developments in Pakistan, and that the risk of instability in Pakistan was profoundly affected by what was happening inside Afghanistan. So that obviously the U.S. is very constrained in what it can do inside Pakistan. The situation there is very, very hard to influence, but it's one that really, I think, has a higher strategic importance for the United States now than simply what might happen inside Afghanistan. So that the way to try and crush Taliban and do what we can to eliminate al-Qaeda in that border area along the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan required a maximum military push in the place we could operate, which was Afghanistan. The President, just to recall for you, in March announced a new military and political and economic strategy in Afghanistan. He appointed Richard Holbrooke to be his special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, taking this political side of the issue out of the State Department bureaucracy and having it report directly to him and to Secretary of State Clinton. And he appointed a new military commander on the ground in Afghanistan, taking a step that President Bush had been extremely reluctant to take in 8 years of the presidency. Obama took in his first 60 days. He removed a military commander and put in a new one, and approved a substantial increase in U.S. forces on the ground. He asked his new military commander, General McChrystal, to go to the field and come back with a recommendation to implement the strategy of counterinsurgency that he announced in March. Now, the McChrystal report has come back in, but we find that the administration is deeply troubled and divided about whether to follow the strategy of its own commander on the ground and of, at least according to press reports, Ambassador Holbrooke, the person they put overall in charge of the political side of things. The reason given for this hesitancy is that the White House was just shocked at the election fraud in the recent Afghan elections. Now, this is from a president from Chicago. Anybody who's shocked at election fraud in a place like Afghanistan isn't paying attention. And in fact, the people who were paying attention knew there would be difficulty. That's part of the inherent nature of trying to have institutions of representative government brought into play in areas that don't have experience with them. We had the same problem in the United States, and I'm not on an apology tour here. I'm just saying that that it is difficult to have corruption-free elections anywhere in the world, including in the United States. So the notion that we now need a fundamental rethinking of our strategy in Afghanistan because the elections were a little bit yucky, I think really calls into question how serious the administration was back in March. We don't know what the outcome will be. It could well be that General McChrystal's recommendation for a troop increase will be granted. But I think the fundamental point is that lost in this debate over the past 2 or 3 weeks has been the appreciation, the real step forward that the Obama administration took in understanding that there was a linkage between what happens in Afghanistan and what happens in Pakistan. And if the pressure on Taliban and al-Qaeda is reduced in Afghanistan, even if we continue to torque it up on the Pakistani side, Taliban will do what it did after the overthrow of the government right after 9/11. It will just shift back from the Pakistani side of the border where it is now back into Afghanistan. And we will be left with the continuing threat in both countries and the particularly acute continuing threat in Pakistan. Now, this to me is 8 months in, as good a laboratory indication of the Obama view of the world as anything you can come up with, because the policies that he's talking about now are his policies. These are not the policies that he simply inherited from George Bush. He had a very active role in changing the policies. He did change them. He had campaigned on the basis that the war in Afghanistan was not a voluntary war. It was a necessary war. It was the right war. It was the good war, up until he ran into difficulty on his health care program with the left wing of the Democratic Party, which has a similarly dim view of defeating the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, heaven forbid that I would say there's a connection between those two facts, but you can bet that our adversaries around the world are watching this decision as carefully as any other decision that the President has made. Now, let me just conclude with one other example, a little bit more in the abstract, but dealing with our strategic posture in the world when it comes to nuclear weapons. Because here I think the theology of the Obama administration is best revealed. And the President said as much in his several speeches in New York last week, and that is that if the United States reduces its level of strategic nuclear weapons toward the ultimate objective of a world without nuclear weapons, that will induce other countries, including Iran and North Korea, to give up their nuclear weapons programs as well. And in his speech to the General Assembly, the President said, we are doing our part in moving toward that world without nuclear weapons because we're negotiating with the Russians for a further, apparently pretty dramatic reduction in our operationally deployed nuclear forces. As if to say, therefore, that now Iran and North Korea should reciprocate. That is a near religious view of how international relations proceeds. Number one, I don't think we should be reducing our level of operationally deployed warheads to the levels that the Russians would like. Number one, they can't sustain their current levels economically. Number two, they don't have any allies to protect. We do worldwide. Russia's only treaty ally at the moment, I think, is Belarus, and congratulations. We've got we've got NATO, we've got Japan and Australia and South Korea. We do have global commitments. We are in a different posture. But the most telling example of this in just the past month, obviously, was the decision to give up construction on the missile defense bases in Poland and the Czech Republic. A lot of people have speculated that Obama traded something with the Russians. I don't think he traded anything. I think that decision reflects the predominant view in his party that national missile defense is not worthwhile. During the Cold War, that view held that missile defense was destabilizing. They've never believed that it could be made operationally effective. And so giving up a program that isn't going to work and isn't very helpful either doesn't require a trade-off. In their mind, it was getting rid of a bad idea. And yet, even there, it was deployed in a way that made it sound like they had simply taken a tactical decision to go in a more effective direction to defend the United States. But let's be clear. Those bases in Poland and the Czech Republic had very little to do with defending Europe. Those were designed to protect the United States against ICBMs launched from Iran or other countries in that region. Setting up land and sea-based missile defense to protect our deployed forces in the Middle East and to protect Europe, I think, is a very good idea if he follows through on it. And I don't have any trouble defending Europe. We've done a very good job of it, although we don't get a lot of gratitude for it. But it's not the same as defending our own homeland. What he's given up, maybe in hopes for Russian concessions on Iran, are assets that would have defended the United States. Now, the argument is that Iran doesn't currently have the capability with missiles to hit the United States. Well, we knew that all along. What we were building was a defense against the day that Iran would have that capability. So we've stopped our defensive measures. Iran has not stopped its progress on ballistic missile development. And there are things called breakthroughs where they actually might move faster than our intelligence predicts that they will, and yet we're now left defenseless. That is a view that's supposed to gain us favor around the world. I think it has left our adversaries shaking their heads and wondering just what the administration is doing. So I give, as a report card for the President, 8 months into his office, a very low grade. I'm very worried that he's not paying attention to our national security adequately, that when he does pay attention to it, he brings a naive Wilsonianism that leaves us defenseless, and that his administration, I fear, is going to end up being proof of the adage that it's not American strength that's provocative, it's American weakness that's provocative. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, thank you very much. Now, as I said at the outset, I'm happy to answer questions, and somebody will correct me if I have this wrong, but I understand the microphones at the desk in this room are active. I wouldn't give law students live microphones if I were the dean of a law school, but it's not my say. For the people in the other room, I think you have to come over here, but is that okay? So. With that, if you just raise your hand, maybe you could tell me your affiliation or whatnot. Yes, sir.
My name is Nico Lachonsky. I'm a sophomore. I'm on the undergraduate advisory board for Duke American Grand Strategy. I want to ask you a question about Obama's personality. Recently, reports came out about French President Nicolas Sarkozy calling Obama incredibly egotistical and incredibly naive. I think this was last week. In fact, Obama's own opening words at his UN speech was that the world has a lot of expectations on me. There's a big emphasis on me in Obama's administration. Every presidency has had a lot of personality traits that could affect their policy. So do you see these personality traits, naivete and arrogance, affecting his policies with regards to the Iran issue, attempting to mandate peace talks between Israel and Palestine, his disarmament goals, health care reform, list could go on. Do you see his personality severely affecting his decisions with those?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a shrink, so I don't I don't know that I should get into that. I think his naivete is overwhelming. I think it is something that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And I thought you were going to quote the story about President Sarkozy after his first meeting, where he said he commented to his aides on how weak he thought the president was. The naive, this is a kind of cycle in American politics. We had it with Jimmy Carter, and it cost us dearly, and I'm afraid we've got it again. I think there's another problem that the president has, though, and it's actually two problems that combine and make me concerned. The first is that he has not transitioned from being a candidate to being the president. And I combine that with the problem that I don't think he has transitioned from being a legislator to being an executive. He's been in the Senate, he's been in the Illinois legislature, and for many legislators, life is you give a speech, you cast a vote, you give a speech, you cast a vote, and you sort of, the biggest thing you manage is your own office. And people sometimes find it difficult to move from being in the legislature to being in the executive. And since I think the legislative modus operandi is a lot closer to the campaign MO than being president, when you combine those two things, I think it's a problem. I don't think in the foreign policy arena giving a speech makes a difference. And so now the president says we need actions as well as words. Well, okay. We're going to see actions in this decision on Afghanistan. So when you combine the idea that, for example, in the Cairo speech, he somehow fundamentally changed the balance of interest and power in that region because of what he said, along with the inexperience and naivete, I think you have a combustible mixture that's not going to be good for the U.S. over the long term. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Danielle Lofton. I'm a graduate student here in Duke Political Science Department. My question speaks to sort of your opening statement regarding a non-belief in American exceptionalism by the administration. And my question is why you foresee that to be a problem. Beyond deciding not to engage in nation building, which many politicians, policymakers would argue is a good thing, why is a non-adherence to American exceptionalism a problem?
I think that looking at the corpus of Obama's speeches, that he does not see himself as America's advocate. He sees himself as, in the words of Evan Thomas, the Newsweek editor, who commented on his speech at the anniversary of the Normandy invasion. He said, he contrasted it with Reagan's, and he said Reagan's speech in 1984 was all about America. Well, footnote, it was not all about America. It talked about the heroism of all the allies who were at D-Day, and even talked about the Russian heroism, and they weren't at D-Day. But in any event, Thomas says, unlike Reagan, Obama didn't just talk about the United States. And then he said, and I'm quoting, he was kind of above all the countries, sort of like God. Now, leaving the God part out, the sort of above all the countries thing, I think is an insight into Obama as being one of 192 leaders, like the quote I gave you from George H.W. Bush about Dukakis. He would say, of course the United States has interest, and there are legitimate interests, and they deserve to be respected, but 191 other countries have legitimate interests too, and we need to, as the community organizers like to say, get all the stakeholders around a table and work it out. That's a very different role for an American president than that of being our advocate. Now, for those of you who are not lawyers, I know there's probably a tendency to say, see, he's thinking that Obama ought to be a lawyer, and you know how lawyers are. They just sort of get a point in mind and they won't let it go, and they ignore contrary evidence, and they're not reasonable. Just speaking as a litigator myself, an advocate is not an irrational actor. An advocate is trying to advance the interest of his client, in this case the United States, in ways that take into account that there's a more complex world out there. I don't see Obama being the kind of advocate that I think a president should be, or that the overwhelming majority of the American people think their president ought to be. Yeah, in the back there.
My name's Cliff Satell. I'm a junior undergrad. You touched on multilateralism a little bit in your speech, and one charge against the Bush administration, and I'm sure you've heard it personally as well, is that under Bush, the United States became too unilateral and as a result became very disliked around the world. Now, my question is, do you think that matters if we're liked or disliked, and what are the consequences of being too liked, or what are the consequences of not being liked?
Well, let me answer the unilateralism versus multilateralism point first, because I think it's important. The first thing is that, at least in the Bush administration, and I can't speak for this one, I don't remember at any point having a debate about unilateralism versus multilateralism, ever. I didn't myself, and I was accused of it as much or more as anybody else, I didn't get up each morning and say, what unilateralist outrage can I perpetrate today? The issue for me was what's going to advance the best interest of the United States. And sometimes that's done unilaterally, sometimes it's done in formal alliance structures, sometimes it's done at the UN, sometimes it's done in a more ad hoc fashion. One of the things I'm proudest of doing in the administration was negotiating the basis for the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is a way of blocking international trafficking in weapons and materials of mass destruction. We negotiated it out with 11 core group members, now up to 15 who agreed to the Statement of Interdiction Principles. Today, over 100 countries have subscribed to the Statement of Interdiction Principles. It is a classic multilateral activity. It's not like the UN. It doesn't have a Secretary General. It doesn't have a headquarters. It doesn't have a secretariat. It doesn't have a lot of meetings of diplomats. As one British diplomat said as we were putting it together, he said, you know, Proliferation Security Initiative is an activity, not an organization. That's as opposed, some would say, to the UN, which is an organization, not an activity. But it's decidedly multilateral. And it has to be, because to have effective counter-proliferation activities, you can't do it just by the United States. So I think that other nations' leaders understand the point that I'm making here, that it's maybe politically advantageous to accuse the Bush administration of unilateralism, but it is factually inaccurate. Therefore, when you have the Obama administration come in and say, we're going to be more multilateral, I think they are choosing a process over a substantive outcome. And it's not the first time that mistake has been made. In the early days of the Clinton administration, when Madeleine Albright was UN ambassador, she said, our policy in this administration is assertive multilateralism. Now, to this day, over 15 years later, I still don't know what assertive multilateralism is. But it seemed to make them feel good, and my guess is we'll see it emerge again. I don't personally care whether a policy is multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral, unilateral, or anything else. I want to know, does it accomplish the objective for the United States in the most effective way? And I think when you explain that to other countries, they understand it, because the little secret is most of them pursue it exactly the same way. Yes, sir, over here.
My name is Jason Rathod. I'm a 3L here at Duke Law. In 2002, you and the Bush administration were making similarly apocalyptic statements as you are today about Iraq, and today you're making them about North Korea and Iran. At the same time, there was a naive state senator from Illinois, and he said at the time at an anti-war rally, even a successful war against Iraq will require a U.S. occupation of undetermined length at undetermined cost with undetermined consequences. An invasion of Iraq without a clear rationale and without strong international support will only fan the flames of the Middle East and encourage the worst rather than the best impulses of the Arab world and strengthen the recruitment arm of al-Qaeda. Can you explain why your view and the Bush administration's view of Iraq was correct and that naive state senator's view was wrong?
Sure, I'd be delighted I'd be delighted to. Do you have any quotes from Mr. Obama on Afghanistan back then? No. Okay. Do you? Well, okay. Well, do you have any of my quotes from back then?
I believe you said they were a year away from producing nuclear.
Wrong. No, never said that. Let me explain what I think the argument for overthrowing Saddam Hussein was and remains, and that is that this was a ruthless dictatorship determined to acquire hegemony over the oil fields surrounding the Persian Gulf. He had used weapons of mass destruction against his own people and in the Iran-Iraq War. He had, even after being defeated in the first Persian Gulf War, kept together over 1,000 nuclear scientists and technicians. He called them his nuclear mujahideen, clearly with the purpose, once free of UN weapons inspectors and sanctions, to return to his nuclear program. The argument about Saddam Hussein, to my mind, was never, did he have active weapons of mass destruction? The issue was, did his regime itself constitute such a threat to international peace and security that it warranted overthrowing it, and in some respects, finishing the unfinished business of the first Persian Gulf War. I think the United States achieved a major strategic victory in overthrowing Saddam, and it had, by the way, the collateral strategic significance of convincing Muammar Gaddafi that if we had just done that to Saddam, he might be next. And he gave up his nuclear weapons program. He agreed that we could come in and take it, and we literally boxed up the Libyan nuclear weapons program and took it to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where it sits today, proving that a country that was really serious about giving up the pursuit of nuclear weapons didn't face the challenge of regime change. Now, I think with respect to Iraq, there are two separate analytical questions. First, were we right in overthrowing Saddam? And second, how did we do after the overthrow? I think they're distinct. I think the answer to the second question, obviously, is it didn't turn out anywhere close to what we wanted. I could go back and argue what we should have done. In my view, what we should have done after the overthrow was immediately turn responsibility back to Iraqis. I don't think that we should have created the Coalition Provisional Authority. I don't think you enhance political maturity by making decisions for other people. I think you enhance it by having them make their own. That period of drift and mismanagement led to the crisis that I think the President solved with his surge strategy. We now see the possibility in Iraq of the institutions of representative government taking place after considerable difficulty and a lot of loss of life, no doubt about it. I don't say that the answer to the second analytical question was correct, but I think it's moving in the right direction. And I say again, and I'd be happy to defend it now or 20 years from now, the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein was unquestionably correct. Yes, ma'am.
Valerie Van Ho, visiting faculty in the Department of Naval Science and grad student in the Department of Political Science. Your point on ballistic missile defense did not include or briefly mention the increase in sea-based ballistic missile defense, specifically the move from 2 to 16 or 18 East Coast ships with BMD capabilities, which is the first time that we've ever even communicated a desire to equal West and East Coast BMD capabilities, which is both faster and more flexible and more operationally proven than the land-based side. Iran was specifically mentioned as a reason for this. How does this affect your stance on the signaling that we're doing on the seriousness that we view BMD?
Well, first, this in part reflects the continuing distortion of military thinking between theater missile defense and national missile defense. The concept of theater missile defense arose in part because the ABM Treaty of 1972 did not preclude it, so that military commanders saw the utility of finding this capability to protect the fleets as they were dispersed around the world, and protecting our deployed forces and protecting places like South Korea and Japan, because what for them what for us is theater missile defense is national missile defense for them. Now, the techniques ultimately that lead to successful theater missile defense scientifically and technologically are translatable into national missile defense. And in fact, the National Missile Defense Testing Program and the bases already established in Alaska and California and the Mid-Pacific testing course have made enormous progress, and they benefit from the Aegis defense system and the THAAD system and others. I don't have any disagreement with enhancing theater missile defense, and in fact, to an extent, properly adopted and supported by the right kinds of radars, the theater missile defense capability can be in the layered missile defense concept useful in the launch phase of defeating ICBMs, not the mid-course phase or the terminal phase, but in the launch phase it might well be helpful. But the idea that shifting to deal with the threat of Iranian short and mid-term missiles is somehow the equivalent of dealing with the threat to the United States itself is just misguided. And the failure to engage in the continuing development of this program and including the construction of these facilities, which were delayed inordinately during the Bush administration as well, I think is giving up a significant measure of the defense capability that we need, especially if Iran does get nuclear weapons. It won't just be a problem with Iran. As I said earlier, I think other countries will get those weapons, and those bases in Europe, not adequate in and of themselves, no doubt about it. They were never conceived as the alpha and the omega. They were a start, and now we don't have them. Yes, sir.
Do you believe the Bush administration should have taken military action against Iran or North Korea?
Well, I think they're two very different circumstances. I think in North Korea, the real answer is China, which has uniquely the capability to turn off the North Korean program. I'll come back to that if somebody wants to follow up on North Korea. But on Iran, I think the decision not to take action before the end of the Bush administration takes you a long way toward what I think is the likely end result that Iran gets nuclear weapons. And I think the option for Israel to use military force is much riskier, much less likely of success than the United States. I think that we're going to get blamed for it anyway. And under the theory that if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right, I would have used force against their program. The longer range issue, though, is regime change. And I think now we've got the evidence that I believed was there to begin with, but I think now demonstrated in the demonstrations after the June 12 presidential election that the population in Iran is aware enough that it's the regime, it's their regime that's the problem, that striking the nuclear facilities would not necessarily have the impact of rallying Iranians to this dictatorial government. Yes, ma'am, in the back there.
To follow up on the North Korea-China issue, how would you suggest getting the Chinese to act more strongly towards North Korea? Because it seems like the Bush administration tried quite a few different ways and none of them were successful.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think the Bush administration tried very hard. We were so busy thanking the Chinese for providing lunches at the six-party talks that there wasn't adequate raising of the priority. The basic issue is that China says they don't want North Korea with nuclear weapons. They don't want that because they worry that if it keeps that capability, others in the region, Japan, South Korea, maybe Taiwan, will develop nuclear weapons capabilities of their own. That would destabilize Northeast Asia and would impede Chinese economic development. I think that's a sensible analysis from China's view, and I take them at their word. They don't want Japan and South Korea and others with nuclear weapons. The problem is that when the Chinese think about what to do about that, their policy becomes schizophrenic. And the reason is that they fear that if they apply too much pressure to North Korea, they will collapse the regime. And the regime in North Korea is very fragile and very narrow. China supplies 80 to 90% of North Korea's energy. It supplies an enormous amount of food and other humanitarian resources, not out of humanitarian impulses necessarily, but to keep the North Koreans on their side of the Yalu River rather than the Chinese side. But this gives China incredible leverage. And I think that what we ought to be doing is saying to the Chinese, you need to use that leverage to achieve the result that you say you want, which is North Korea without nuclear weapons. Now, the problem for China is that they worry that if they begin to apply pressure, they won't be able to calibrate it. They will apply too much and the regime will collapse. And the result then will be that the South Korean and American forces south of the demilitarized zone, in order to prevent anarchy and a huge flow of refugees into South Korea, and to try and get hold of the nuclear weapons, although we don't know much about them, will go in and you could well have North and South Korea reunified. And that's fundamentally where the difference is between China and the United States. At least in theory, our policy remains as it was in 1945 when the peninsula was divided. We want it reunited. The Chinese do not want it reunited. They fear that if it were reunited, they'd see American forces on the Yalu River. They didn't like that movie the first time they saw it. They don't like it any better today. So this is where their policy becomes schizophrenic. Afraid to apply too much pressure to North Korea, they basically don't apply any at all. And that leads to a situation where North Korea keeps its nuclear weapons, and you have the risk of Northeast Asia becoming destabilized. So my answer to your question is we've got to raise the profile of this issue with China. We've got to tell them, as we ultimately did in the conceitedly very different circumstances of the divided Germany, we've got to explain to them that Korea is not going to be divided forever. They ought to get on the right side of history. They ought to remove the nuclear problem. They ought to help us deal with this regime and ultimately accept reunification. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I remember reading back in about 2002 and 2003 going into the Iraq War that one of the parts of the strategy was, in fact, that I guess you could call it a domino effect, that it would have a big effect on Iran to have a democracy right next door, and Iran was at the time seen as a relatively pro-Western population, at least as far as the Middle East goes. Do you believe that the commotion surrounding the last Iranian election vindicates that strategy? And do you believe that regime change could conceivably happen in Iran without U.S. intervention?
Well, I think that in part it's a vindication because there's obviously a lot of communication that goes back and forth between the Shia population in Iraq, which is 50 to 60% of the total, and Shia inside Iran. And, you know, everybody can watch what happens, not necessarily the way Al Jazeera reports it, but people know what is happening. And I think the reaction inside Iran after the clearly stolen, fraudulent June 12 election shows that people had expectations, unrealistic in my view, and not consistent with the way the Iranian government really functions, that, you know, they would have a free and fair election and that the outcome would be respected. So I think what's happened inside Iran is that the opposition to the regime has hardened and spread. I think it's more widespread than it was before. But despite that, I think it's now, as a practical matter, harder to imagine the regime being overthrown because the Revolutionary Guards and the besieging militia and others with real force now have a larger role than they did before. So that's why I say it was a missed opportunity. But I don't think there's any doubt that what's going on in Iraq is having an impact in the region. But I also want to be clear, I don't think Iraq is free of the difficulties and the dangers that it's going to face in the years ahead, and the possibility that it fractures along confessional lines remains. I don't think that possibility has ended by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, all the way in the back there.
You've stated a couple of times that we have this nuclear, North Korean nuclear Iran on the way, but is there any real policy that, in your mind, could stop this from happening?
Stop Iran?
Or North Korea?
Well, North Korea's already got it, so it's a question of how you reverse it. In the case of Iran, as I said earlier, I think the game is pretty close to being over. I think you're going to have the greatest likelihood at this point is an Iran with nuclear weapons. And I've spent close to 9 years now refusing to accept that, because I think once Iran gets nuclear weapons, the whole calculus in the region changes, the way you deal with Iran changes, what happens with other countries with nuclear weapons changes. The only way to be safe against proliferation is to stop these weapons from coming into the hands of regimes like that. And that's why I think, really, we're going to know the answer within a very short period of time if Israel decides to use force. I don't know what they're going to do, but I think that is the only external factor that can stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Ideally, if you had regime change, that might be the other way. In the limited number of cases we've had where there have been fundamental regime changes in South Africa, which gave up its nuclear weapons program when the apartheid regime fell, in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, which gave back the nuclear warheads on their territory when the Soviet Union collapsed, a fundamentally different kind of government in Iran could give up the nuclear program. But I don't see that happening in time for them to make the decision. And, what happens if a democratic or representative government came into power in Iran after it had nuclear weapons? I don't know whether they would give them up or not. I just don't know. I don't want to have to deal with that hypothetical. I want to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons first, and I think we've just about lost that struggle.
Can you say something about what you would see after an Israeli military?
Yeah, Professor Morris was asking what I would see after an Israeli preemptive strike. I think there's no certain way to judge what Iran will do. It is an apocalyptic regime, and Ahmadinejad is a direct philosophical descendant of the Ayatollah Khomeini in that regard. But I think that the actual outcomes are likely to be a lot less dramatic for the U.S. in particular than many people think. I think they're most critical for Israel. But let me just run through them in turn quickly. The idea that Iran is going to close the Straits of Hormuz, I think, is flat wrong. I don't think they'll try. If they do, their navy will be on the bottom of the Persian Gulf in pretty short order. Number two, that they would cease exporting their own oil and natural gas. I don't think that's likely, because that would destroy their own economy, and I don't think even in their wildest dreams they really want to do that. Number three, they could increase terrorist attacks primarily against U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, but maybe elsewhere in the Middle East or more broadly worldwide. I don't think that's the direction to go in, because that would risk a direct confrontation with the United States militarily, and I don't think they want that. They could attack Israel directly with their short and medium-range missiles or aircraft. I don't think they'll do that, because the risk there is that Israel won't wait. As the missiles are coming in, Israel won't wait to see if they're conventional warheads, that Israel will respond with a nuclear retaliation, and I don't think the Iranians want that. So as much by process of elimination as anything else, I think the most likely Iranian response is that they unleash Hezbollah and Hamas with rocket attacks against Israel. And I think Hezbollah's essentially completely resupplied since the 2006 war, maybe more so. They have rockets that can range every civilian location in Israel. It raises the stakes for Israel, and it's one of the issues that the government obviously has to consider before it decides on whether it's going to take preemptive action or not. But most likely that, I think, would be the Iranian response. Yes, sir.
I'm occasionally called upon to do some reporting when interviews are going on. And back in the mid-'90s, I was asked to record an interview with Nawal al-Zadawi, who's an Egyptian scholar who was here, a leader of the women's rights movement in the Middle East. And I was extremely impressed with her analysis of many of the issues that we've talked about today, but in particular, of course, also cultural issues. And this was an interview for a program leading into the women's conference in Beijing. I subsequently was listening to the radio and heard a vociferous and dismissive attack on that conference, and it came from the State Department. And I called the State Department and I asked for the office that's in charge of attacking the UN. And the operator didn't bat an eye, and 5 seconds later I was on the phone with you. And what I'd like to ask...
You want to tell me what year that was?
It was about 95 or 6.
Well, I wasn't in the government in 95 or 96, so you weren't talking to me.
Well, it was the Office
Go
of
ahead, try
International-
again. That was the Clinton
International-
administration, and you ought to know I was not part of the Clinton administration. Go ahead.
Well, it was...
I'm sure there's a question in here. Go ahead.
Well, the question is why would anyone attack the UN convening a women's conference in Beijing?
I don't know that I ever had anything to say about the women's conference in Beijing, honestly. I think that part of the UN's problem, though, is that it has so many different activities that it undertakes that its focus is diluted and its effectiveness is reduced as a consequence. And I'd have to say I didn't follow the Women's Summit in Beijing that carefully, so I can't really say what came out of it positively or negatively. But I would say that as a general proposition, when you try and do too many things at once, you're more than likely not to do them very effectively, and particularly on issues that don't involve the UN's core area of responsibility, which is international issues. So to that extent, that's probably one reason I didn't follow the Women's Summit that closely. So I better ask this lady here for the next question. Go ahead.
Honduras. What is your take on this administration's policy on Honduras?
I think it's an embarrassment to the United States. This is a situation where the democratically elected Congress of Honduras and a unanimous Honduras Supreme Court attempted to defend a provision in the Honduran Constitution based on the historical experience of Honduras and many Latin American countries against the phenomenon known as the caudillo, the strong man, the leader who comes into office, perhaps democratically, and who looks around and says, this is a pretty good deal, I think I'll stay. So the Honduran Constitution has a provision that its presidents only have one term, and it goes further and says, and that can't be overturned by referendum that the president might propose, because they have seen successive leaders try and manipulate the Constitution to perpetuate themselves in power. So Zelaya, whether at the suggestion of Hugo Chavez or Danny Ortega or anybody else, was in the judgment, the unanimous judgment of the Honduran Supreme Court, which was appointed over the years by successive democratically elected civilian governments, basically ordered the military to stop Zelaya from overturning the Constitution. Now, this is probably a matter where where, by the way, Zelaya was succeeded in office by the number 2 designated in the Constitution to succeed to the presidency when there's a vacancy in the office. So if this was a military coup, all I can say is this was not your father's military coup. This was an effort, let's say it was imperfect, let's just grant that, to prevent Zelaya from doing what other caudillos have done in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and elsewhere in Latin America. And for us to take the position that we have in a knee-jerk reaction, I have yet to hear anybody from the State Department explain how the expulsion from office of President Zelaya violated the Honduran Constitution, to the point where the Secretary of State has even said we wouldn't recognize or might not recognize an election to pick his successor. The obvious answer here is have another election. Don't let Micheletti or Zelaya compete in it. Have it completely open and transparent, fill the country with international observers, make sure it's free and fair, and then recognize the successor. That's what we ought to do. And instead, we're hung up, and now we've got, let's be clear, this guy, Zelaya, got back into the country. He's holed up in the Brazilian embassy. Remember, by the way, when Latin Americans used to say, Yankee, go home, stop interfering in our internal affairs? How about them apples for Brazil to be, no, anyway, don't get me started. And during the course of this, Zelaya has said that he is the target of Israeli mercenaries who are zapping him with X-rays, causing him to become physically ill. So I would say that's evidence of fruitcake status. And even worse than that, he didn't say, Ecuadorian mercenaries or Burmese mercenaries. He said Israeli mercenaries. This is about Jews. And I think that shows the guy's an anti-Semite. So I'd like to ask Secretary Clinton why we're backing an anti-Semitic authoritarian against the democratically elected leadership of the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and why we don't get off this kick. I guess I'll take one or two more, and then we probably in the back there.
What do you think about Bob Gates, and what do you think? How much influence do you think he has in this administration?
I don't know how much influence he has. I don't know who's running national security policy in this administration. Honestly, by this time, in most administrations, you can figure out how decisions are made, where the influence lies, and whatnot. I can't discern what the decision-making path is here. I think Secretary Gates, throughout his career, has been a very successful bureaucrat, and I think he's still a very successful bureaucrat. I'll take one more. Yes, ma'am? Yeah.
You started your talk by calling President Obama the first post-American president we had. I think it'd be fair to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit. I know you spoke about American exceptionalism. I understand that. But the context these days may require more explanation about exactly how you meant that.
Well, I think he sees himself as having a broader role in the world than simply being the American president. And I think that it is reflected in a variety of the actions and statements that he's made, which I tried to explain. I think he really feels he's above all that patriotism stuff. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying it's un-American. I'm not saying it's anti-American. I'm picking very deliberately the word post-American in the sense that Europeans, many Europeans, will say they now consider themselves citizens of Europe, not French, not German. They too, many Europeans, not all, have risen above that patriotism stuff and have ceded substantial amounts of what they call competencies or power to Brussels, so that you can talk to people from all over Europe who believe they have transcended that narrow nationalism and achieved something new and different in the EU. And I think, as President Obama reflects so many of those same kinds of social democratic inclinations, I think he has that same kind of desire to move beyond what he would describe as narrow nationalism. That's why I called him post-American. All right, we'll take one more. But this is the end.
Thank you very much, and I just want to thank Duke for inviting you here today. It's been quite an education. My name is Marin Magat. I'm a graduate of the Stanford Institute of Public Policy, and here's my question. I do not have children of my own, and I am not educated enough to know if you do. However, I ask, and this cuts back to our question about global citizenship, so a question that I have for myself. Would you consider the children that you most care about, whether your own or others, to be global citizens? And if so, what did they think about Obama's international global policy?
Well, I don't think that there is any content to the idea of international citizenship. Citizenship, if it means anything, at least in societies that have representative governments, means being part of a defined constitutional structure. And you can't be a citizen of an entity that doesn't exist. This is not just a reflection of historical development. For representative governments, I think it's important because the concept of citizenship embodies who holds sovereignty, who makes decisions about our government policies. When I was an undergraduate, I had a class at Yale under a professor named Robert Dahl, who was a very famous theorist of democratic theory. And in one of the classes, this is in the late 60s, so you take it for what it's worth, but in one of the classes, he said, he talked about a debate in the Netherlands that was going on where the responsible people in the Netherlands said, you know, everything the United States does affects us so much. We have no say in it. We have no way of affecting what the United States does. We want to vote in American elections. And because we ought to have a say. So Robert Dahl threw this out to the class, and you know, it was the late 60s. Everybody thought it was a great idea. They just thought it was a great idea. So I raised my hand, and I said, well, I think that's fine. Let's have the Dutch vote in our elections as long as we can vote in theirs. Okay? So that's my take on world citizenship. Thank you very much.